They told me the tower was for watching fires. They lied. The first sentence out of my mouth the night I signed the log was thin with too much daylight and not enough sleep. I'll stay the night. It sounded like a promise. By midnight, it felt like a sentence. I'm not brave, I'm practical. I grew up knowing how weather works, how wind finds the same hollow every year, how deer follow the creek in a pattern older than roads. That's why I put my name on the rota when someone called in sick, because the tower needed eyes and I had a flashlight. The tower sits like a crooked tooth against the forest, a wooden thing balanced on a lattice of tired beams, its cabin windows boxed in thin, harsh light. From the road, it looks useful. From inside, it looks like a small, honest prison. The forest smelled of rain and old resin the night I climbed the ladder. Pine sap, damp earth, and the sour tang of something that had died and been left to think about it. The wood of the lookout groaned under my boots, and the radio on my hip hummed a neighborly static that never quite carried a voice. I set up a thermos, a notebook, and a small lamp, thinking of how a few quiet hours would pass and the dawn would take the rest. That is what everyone believes before the forest teaches them otherwise. At first, the other noises were the kind you can explain. Branches rubbing, a fox scratching, a distant truck like an animal coughing. Then the animals stopped. The cicadas cut off like a switch, the frogs were gone. The forest knit itself into a blacker kind of quiet that felt deliberate, as if the whole place had leaned in to listen. I saw them first as nothing, smudges at the edge of the light, where the trees pressed together and the fog clots low to the ground. I watched them because I thought they were deer. Then the outline resolved wrong, the shoulders too narrow, the heads too round. When the beam from my flashlight hit them, their eyes blinked back white and wrong, like coins picked clean. They didn't move like animals. They moved like people who had been practicing moving without making sound. Slow, patient, with limbs that unfolded in the night, like something remembering how to be a body. One of them smiled. You learn a lot about yourself when you find a smile in the dark aimed at you. Your heart arranges itself into polite beats. Your mouth wants to say helpful things. Who are you? This is private land. But those phrases sound childish next to shapes that have teeth bright as chipped porcelain and no expectation of being noticed. I kept the flashlight steady. I kept the radio on. I kept telling myself stories about lanterns and drunks and hunters who had lost their way. None of it fit into the space under the tower's light. The figures bunched at the tree line and watched as if I were a new and interesting specimen, their heads tilted together, whispering without sound. The air tasted metallic. The watchroom, which had felt like a refuge, felt thin, just enough shelter to keep whatever was outside from being obvious, and not enough to make it stop. I signed the log at E3 because habit is stubborn. I wrote my name as if ink could anchor me. Then I heard the first proper sound that was not forest or wind, something soft and steady, like 100 small feet organizing themselves into a pattern. It moved closer. The sound was like dry leaves being counted. I pressed my back to the cool wood of the tower and watched the beam from my flashlight split the darkness into obedient stripes. The things at the edge of the trees did not scatter. They arranged themselves, each one a shadow fitting into a pattern someone else had drawn. When I tried to speak, the radio answered with a thin laugh that could have been static or could have been someone turning their mouth to the night. I climbed down because my hands shook and I thought panic would be solved by distance. The ladder was colder than I expected. Each rung hummed like a tuning fork under my palms, and the forest smelled now of iron and something sticky. Old blood or old batteries, I couldn't tell. At the base of the ladder, the ring of fog that had been nothing more than aesthetic on the walk-in thickened into something that looked like breath, made visible. When my foot hit the ground, the sound stopped. So did my heartbeat. So did every rational thing I had left. They were closer than they'd been when I was watching. Close enough to see the trees between them. Close enough that I could tell the mouths were too wide. Close enough that their skin, if that's what it was, caught the flashlight in a way that made it seem like they were rubbed with ash. One of them lifted its head. When it turned, I realized it wasn't turning at all. Its head slid, like a picture being pulled across a table. It smiled with the patience of something that has practiced patience for centuries. "Hey," my voice rose where I had meant it to be flat, practical. "Hey, this is private property. Go." The sentence stuck somewhere between my teeth and the cold air. They did not answer. Instead, one walked forward on feet that made no sound and stood with its hands at its sides as if it were waiting for permission. I reached into my pocket for pepper spray I'd never intended to use and found, instead, a key. A small, rusted key on a ring of leather. I had never carried a key up the ladder. I had never put anything in that pocket. For a second, I thought I was dreaming badly. For a second, I thought that the key was a joke left by some cruel coworker. The nearest figure cocked its head and looked at my pocket. It did not blink. Then it tapped its finger against the inside of its wrist, as if checking an invisible watch. I heard the thyme-sour smell of mushrooms, and immediately, disgustingly, the mnemonic of a time when I had been a child in a cemetery and chased by a boy who liked to show me maggots in the grass. Something else happened then, small, ordinary, and terrible. From behind me, the watchroom door creaked shut. I had left it open. The latch clicked. The tower was a thin shell around me. My radio started up again, and a voice cut through the static, so close to my ear it felt like someone had put a mouth there and leaned in. The voice said my name. I spun. The tower's single window reflected back not the room, but an impossible other. In that glass, I saw a man who had been in my dreams for years. Thinner at the temples than I remember, eyes too bright, a grin that reached too far. He was not me. He was not a stranger either. He held the logbook open, and in a hand I recognized as mine, because there are certain ways my I's dot and my T's cross that betray me. There was a name written that should not have been there, my last name, followed by a date that had not yet occurred. I slammed my palm against the window. The reflection did not flinch. The reflected man turned the pages. On each page were entries from nights I had never spent, names I had known from news clippings, dates that belonged to funerals. My stomach rolled. Air left me in a small animal sound. Outside, one of the figures pressed its face to the glass. For an instant, its eyes matched the white coins I'd seen earlier. Then, impossible, grotesque, its face flattened, like dough pressed with a palm, and the features reformed into something both like and not like me. It smiled the way the man in the reflection did. It mouthed something I could not quite catch. I thought I heard, "You forgot the key." I remember running. I remember the ladder biting into my palms. I remember thinking, if I could just get down the road, I could drive away, and this would be a story about shaking hands and too many bad choices. Halfway down the rungs, I felt fabric between my fingers. I looked up, and a hand was through the slats of the cabin, fingers long and thin, and it held a notebook. Not the logbook. My notebook, the one with the thermos stain on the cover. My name was written on the first page in my handwriting. The fingers tugged, the notebook slid free and dropped into the fog, and as it fell, it opened to a page where in the same ink were words I had not yet written. They were simple, and they were a map to the moment I now inhabited. Do not climb down. Below that, in smaller script, they learn by your leaving. I froze. The figures gathered softly around the fallen book like children around a broken toy. A chorus started up that was not wind or birds, a susurrus of words without air, a language made of the spaces between syllables. It found the seam of my jaw and started to pry. One of them tapped the window twice. Tap, tap, a metronome for my failing will. I swear to you, the world narrowed to that glass and the face behind it, and when it smiled at me, it smiled as if it had been waiting a very long time for me to notice. They were patient with me until I remembered the key. My fingers closed around the cold metal like it was an accusation. For a long second, I only listened. The rhythm of the things outside, the soft scuffle of their bodies in the fog, the tower wood settling like a giant breathing. The taste of copper was heavy in my mouth. I could still hear the echo of the voice in the radio calling my name, as if someone had threaded a wire from their throat to mine. The phrase, "They learn by your leaving," looped in my head until it had weight. It made the key feel less like a lost object and more like a prompt. If they learned when I left, what did staying mean? What did this key open that had my life in it? The glass with the other me wrote in my handwriting even as my hand clenched the key. The reflected man turned a page, and the date on it was nearer than I had thought possible. I made a decision that had no courage in it, only calculation. If leaving taught them how to be me, I would not let them learn anything more than they already had. I climbed back, slow, methodical, each rung a small victory against the cold reaching up from the ground. The fog curled around my calves like fingers. The figures watched but did not move to stop me. They only shifted closer, an audience rehearsing the end of a play they had seen 1,000 times. Inside the watchroom, everything looked the same and wrong, in the same way a dead person's smile looks right until you try to meet it. The logbook lay where I had left it on the ledge, the ink in it dry and impossible. The glass reflected the room, but the reflected room held an extra object, a little brass keyhole inset into the wooden table beneath the logbook. There was no keyhole in my world. My heart kicked through my ribs like it wanted to get out and warn someone. Beneath the floorboards, the thin brass edge of a trap slid when I pressed the table with both palms. The key fit. It slipped into a lock that should not have been there and turned with a clean, ancient sound, like a mouth opening. The reflected man smiled so widely, I thought his face would split. His hand, in the glass, paused to rest on the page that bore my name. When the lock clicked, the tower answered with paper. Pages rustled even though no wind moved. The little tin box under the floorboard had been a ledger more than a box, a thing that recorded and taught. Inside were slips, dozens of them, folded and dog-eared, each a scrap of someone's leaving. Names, dates, the place they had been taken from. There were photographs, too, half-burned Polaroids of faces I recognized from county reports, faces I had seen on missing person posters at gas stations. My stomach fell out of me when I found one photo of my own hands, palms up, taken from above. The thermos stain on my notebook was visible in the corner. On the desk, the logbook's page turned, as if by its own will. My hand moved in the glass and wrote a line I did not feel my fingers make. Signed, and then a name that matched mine, followed by a date that was a small, clean future. Ink bled like a wound. The reflected man looked up, and with the same slow patience the things outside used, set the pen down and tapped twice on the glass. Tap, tap, an invitation or a verdict. I tried destruction because it is the only honest response we are taught. I tore pages, slammed the logbook shut, shoved the ledger into the stove, and struck a match. The pages smoked and curled, and the smoke smelled like the forest at the moment it decides to forget a life. The flame licked the ink, and the letters only darkened and multiplied, as if the fire taught the paper new words rather than consuming them. When the ash settled, the pages were whole again, stacked on the desk as if they had been waiting to be read. They learned fast. One of the figures pressed its face to the window. Its eyes were coins polished to a wrong shine. Where its mouth should have been, there was a new, imperfect likeness of my own jaw, an impression their hands had learned by watching me grit my teeth. It mouthed a shape close to a word, and I heard, in a voice like broken static, "Right." The reflected man held the pen out toward me. It was a small, ridiculous thing to refuse. Paper demanded names the way a trap demands bait, but I felt the key in my palm as if it were hot. I thought if I could lock the ledger, if I could keep the pages from being read, I might hold them off. I turned the key again, and the sound the lock made was different. A hollow, doomed sound, like a bell tolling underwater. They began to pry at the seams of the cabin. Fingers found the joints. The tower had seemed a refuge because it was designed to keep wind and fire out, not what lay beneath the map of reason. 100 small hands found purchase under the floor, in the banister, under the windowsill, and with a patience that made patience monstrous, they started to work the wood apart. The radio in the corner rose into voice, not static this time, but a chorus in my own cadence. It repeated the way I say my name when I want to sound steady. I understood then. Understanding arrived like a bruise. Their learning was not mimicry alone. It was ledger and river. When a person left the tower, the paper recorded their leaving and taught the things how to fold themselves into the world the leaver had left behind. The key was not a shield, it was a translator. Turn it in the lock, and the ledger spoke your name into the bark of the forest. There was a choice that compressed into the last beat of my heart. I could try to run, carry the ledger out past the fog and keep it from being read, but the act of leaving would teach them how to chase me, how to be my shape in open air. Or I could stay and break what remained of me on this table, trying to starve the ledger of new words. Both options were a kind of loss. Hands found my ankles first, cold, patient, learning to fit, and pulled. I kicked and hammered, but the pull below was learning with a long memory. One of the faces at the window matched the angle of my childhood in a photograph I destroyed once and buried in a box. It watched as something warm collected in the hollows of its cheeks, a mimicry of tears, a final empathy. They wanted not only to be me, but to know the thing that made me leave. My fingers brushed the pen as it slid toward me across the desk. I thought of the thermos stain and the splash of coffee that would become a smear in some other person's memory. I thought of the dates in the book and the neatness of my handwriting. I thought of how small, odd things, an out-of-place key, a stain, a missed call, turned into footholds for whatever learns from absence. They pulled harder. My weight tipped. I felt wood give, and the cold slid up into my lungs like a tide. The last thing I saw before the world folded was my face in the window, ages away and already patient, already used to the waiting. The reflected man closed the logbook with a soft thumb. The pen moved once on my page. The date there clenched like a fist. I remember the sound of a door shutting, clean and polite, behind me as if someone had simply come in and closed it. Then the quiet settled, the kind that listens. I am the one in the glass.
Subscribe to Horror Story Bar.